for joining this very important information session. Jessica Aurora Ugart, who is the tax credit supervisor with the Virginia Department of Historic Resources, will provide an overview on the federal and state rehabilitation tax credit programs. Following the presentation, there will be a live question and answer session. Feel free to add any questions you have throughout the presentation in the chat box, and we will take those at the end of the presentation. Remember to keep yourself muted during the presentation, and during the Q&A portion, feel free to unmute and ask your question. This session will be recorded and will be posted on the Planning Department webpage as well as the city's YouTube page. And with that, I will go ahead and let Jessica get started.
Hello, thank you for having me. Let me get my screen up properly. Great, so hopefully everybody can see that very well. The presentation today is Revitalization through Rehabilitation. It's about the Historic Tax Credit Program. My name is Jessica Ugarte, and I am the tax credit supervisor for the program. So that means that I oversee the review that we do, the review staff that we have, and I kind of try to help answer any sorts of questions that might come up. There are 4 staff members that are dedicated to the tax credit program, and we're all able to help if there's any questions. So my presentation today is going to be kind of 2 different parts. The first part will be the actual process of the tax credit, kind of how you apply. And the second part will be the standards for rehabilitation. And that's kind of what we're looking for and what kind of should be guiding a rehabilitation that's seeking tax credits. So first, a little bit of an introduction to our program. It was established by the General Assembly in 1996, so our program has been around for quite a while. It was modeled on the Federal Historic Rehabilitation Tax Credit Program, which was created in 1977. So while we're pretty early, we're definitely not the first to have a state program. But we really do work with the federal side of the program. So we work with the National Park Service, and we are always the kind of first point of contact in working with the National Park Service if you are doing a program that's seeking both state and federal credits. And we'll talk more about that in future slides. So back in 2018, the VCU did a study on the Virginia Historic Tax Credit Program, and so you can see some of the statistics here that were found out as a part of that study. So as of 2018, we had $4.5 billion in economic impact for the state, 2,900 full and part-time jobs annually. And what we found was that a lot of the people that were surveyed about this program said that tax credits were very important in their decision to do a project. I was able to pull some new stats. So as of September of this year, of 2021, we have had over 3,209 tax credit projects finalized and certified. So that's a pretty exciting number. So what are tax credits? They are available for rehabilitation.
Miss Ugarte, doesn't look like the slides.
Oh, really?
Your slides aren't showing. We're just still seeing the cover page.
No, I'm sorry. That's what are you seeing now?
Okay, now we're seeing the comparison of credit.
I apologize. So
No
yep.
problem.
Well, we will. I won't have it be full screen then. So that's not a problem. Thank you for speaking up. Okay, so back to that. So this was the slide that I was just talking about. I'll let you kind of look at that. This is
the person that dialed in could please go back on mute.
Great. Okay, so here's that slide that I was talking about that nobody could apparently see, talking about the economic impact study that VCU did for our program back in 2018. So again, some great numbers, just kind of really showing how Virginia's tax credits have helped to incentivize rehabilitation within our communities. So now back to where I started. Great. Okay, so what are tax credits? Everybody should be seeing that on your slide right now. So they are available for the rehabilitation of certified historic structures, and we'll talk more about that in a future slide. They are a dollar for dollar reduction in income tax liability. So there has to be some sort of tax liability in order to get credits. It's not a grant and it's not money that you kind of just get as a check. It has to be against that income tax liability. The amount of credits is based on a percentage of the qualified rehabilitation expenditures. So that is the qualified costs that go into the rehabilitation. And we'll talk more about that in future slides as well. As you might have heard at the beginning, there are two separate programs. There's the federal tax credit program. That's the one that was started in 1977. And then there's the state program. And these two programs are very distinct. The National Park Service runs the federal program, we run the state program, and so we kind of work in parallel, but there's a lot of working together between the state and federal program. There are some differences between the two programs. The federal program is only for income producing properties, so that's rental properties, stores, anything where you are gaining income from that building. The credit is 20% of the eligible rehabilitation costs. So say you spend $100,000 on a rehabilitation, it would be $20,000 in credits. There is a 5-year holding period for the federal program. And so that means that the person who is awarded the credits needs to maintain ownership of that building for a 5-year period. If you end up selling it 2 years, there is a prorated amount that you wouldn't get. So the additional 3 years kind of split up. For the federal program, you can carry the credits forward for 20 years. So into the future, each year, you can take a certain amount on your tax liability, and there's 1 year of carryback. The state program, we're very lucky in that in addition to income producing properties like the federal program, owner-occupied buildings can also take advantage of this program in the exact same way that an income producing. So if your home or something like that. Our credit is even more generous than the federal program. We have 25% credit. So again, in that $100,000 QRE, qualified rehabilitation expenses, you'd get $25,000 credit back. There is no holding period, so it is possible to do your rehabilitation, get it certified, and then you can sell the property. So that's one of the benefits that the state program has. There is a 10-year carry forward, but no carry back. So that's kind of something to be aware of as you're planning your project. So how to qualify? It must be a certified historic structure, and we'll talk more about what that is, but that's kind of an important part. It needs to be a certified historic structure. The work, so all work to the property must follow the standards for rehabilitation and other program guidance. We will talk more about the standards for rehabilitation in the second part of it. It's 10 standards that kind of guide all of the work. But that's kind of important to remember that all of this work needs to follow those guidelines and our program guidance. The buildings, you must structure the ownership appropriately. So if it's an owner-occupied house, that's easy, but where it gets into a little bit more tricky situations is if there's an LLC or a business that is owning a building. We are not tax professionals or lawyers, so while we can try to give some advice, it's very important that if there is a business structure for rehabilitation, you need to work with kind of the professionals that do that sort of work and make sure that everything's structured appropriately. This is another thing that we will talk about a little bit later on. There is a minimum expenditure. So the project needs to meet required spending thresholds within a specific measuring period. And those thresholds depend on the project and depend on what program you're going after. And so there's kind of quite a few different variables, but kind of the base thing to remember is that this isn't a program for just very small projects. So if you're just, repainting the inside and it's not a substantial rehabilitation, tax credits might not be possible. It really needs to be for kind of substantial rehabilitations. But again, we'll talk more about that. We are the government, so we love our forms and our kind of different parts of that. So it is a three-part application process. Part 1 is the determination of eligibility. Part 2 is the description of proposed work, and then the Part 3 is the certification of completed work. Of course, we have paperwork for all of these. The state program does have its own paperwork. However, if you are applying for both the state and the federal program, we try to make it a little bit easier so that you just use the federal program's applications for almost all of it. That way you're not having to kind of recreate everything on 2 different sets of paperwork. So we try our best to make it as easy as possible. So I mentioned that we were going to talk about what certified historic structures are. So what this is individually listed on the national or state register and or certified as a contributing building within a listed historic district. So I know you all have a historic district, so if it's, as long as the building is listed as a contributing structure, it's eligible for the program. Specifically, for the federal program, it has to be either on the National Register as a district or as an individually listed building, or it needs to be listed within 30 months of the project being completed. So that's kind of an important thing for the federal program. We are very lucky with the state credit. We don't have to actually have it be listed on the National Register. So say the building isn't actually listed, it just needs to be found to be potentially eligible for individual listing. And we kind of have a different process for that. It's less kind of involved than the National Register nomination process. So we find this a lot for kind of smaller buildings, homeowner occupied buildings where perhaps it's not listed on the National Register, but it still kind of can be found to be eligible for listing. So that's kind of something that is good to remember, even if you have a building that's outside of a historic district. That doesn't necessarily mean for the state credit that all hope is lost. So here is an example of, this is the state form. Again, the federal form is slightly different, but it's a lot of the same information. So the Part 1 form is really us finding out about the building and what it looks like today, because some of the times the nominations can be many decades old and many things can change over those decades. So what the Part 1 is really is that evaluation of, is that building still contributing to the historic district, or does it still maintain its integrity? Is it still there? Things like that. So we're looking at information like, where's the property? How is it historic? Who is the project contact? If you have somebody, helping you with it, who is the owner? What does the building look like? When was it built? What is its significance? And don't forget maps and photos. A lot of this information, specifically with projects, with buildings that are on the National Register, a lot of this information, such as the statement of, what this is, the significance, will be in that National Register nomination. So we're not expecting you to, have a historian's thesis on this where you've done tons of research. A lot of it is just information that's already out there and available. And we can also assist with kind of what's being looked at, and you just kind of do your best. We definitely work with everybody from, consultants that have been doing this for, the past 10 years, 20 years to first-time homeowners. So we're always happy to kind of meet people where they need. With the Part 1, one of the big parts of it is photographic documentation. So I wanted to kind of include some notes. The photograph should clearly document all elevations of the historic building and any outbuildings, both historic and non-historic. We're trying to get a snapshot in time of what the building looks like at the beginning of the kind of project. We also want to see the overall building's site and setting, kind of what's around it, what does the landscape look like, primary interior spaces, and any significant architectural features. Don't worry too much about that, but we're just kind of trying to get an idea of the overall building for this part 1 so that we can make that determination of eligibility. The photos always need to be clear and well lit. We will not be able to process a application that has dim photos, or sometimes we have issues with resolution, and because these are formal kind of record documents, they do need to be kind of well taken and bring in extra light if there's no power. Photos must be submitted in hard copy. We cannot do anything electronically, and they should be printed on photo quality paper. It doesn't need to be super glossy, just maybe not, normal copy paper. And the photos do need to be at least 4 inches by 6 inches. You can have 2 photos on a standard page, or you can, go to a photo lab and get copies printed out, really whatever works best for you, but they do need to be a standard size. For part 1, approximately 20 photos is usually sufficient for a kind of a typical size project. If you are doing with the part 1 just kind of the bare minimum of the 20 photos or roundabouts, more photos will be needed for the part 2, and we'll kind of go over that a little bit later. So the part 2 is kind of the meat of the application process. We always strongly suggest that the part 2 is submitted before beginning work. Sometimes that doesn't happen. We understand that. You're not prevented from participating in the program if the work has already started. It just sometimes can make things difficult, because if work was done that doesn't meet the standards or kind of is outside of compliance with program guidance, there might need to be some corrective work. So whenever possible, try to get that application in before you start work. All proposed work, so everything being done to the property, both interior, exterior, site work, modern buildings, all work needs to meet the Secretary of Interior standards for rehabilitation. And again, we'll go over those in the second half of the presentation. And again, all work at the site needs to be included for review. Even if it's new construction, even if it's site work, you need to let us know kind of the full scope of everything that's being done so that we can look at these projects in their totality, because we are looking at everything. The other very important thing with the part 2 to remember is that all work needs to be fully described in the written narrative writing space of the part 2 application. So you need to explain what work is being done in that narrative, and then use supplementary materials such as plans, drawings, things like that, just for additional clarity. But what can't happen is that, the written narrative is very brief, and then you have tiny little notes on the plans telling, what's happening. We really need to have it be laid out very clearly in that written narrative. And again, we work with, historians to, homeowners that have never done this sort of thing. We have a good ability to kind of meet you where you need to be, but you just need to kind of try to explain as best you can. And we're pretty good at figuring out what you might be talking about. One of the questions that we usually get is, what are eligible expenditures? So as you heard me talking about, the credits are based on the qualified eligible rehabilitation expenses. So it includes nearly all work inside and outside of the historic structure. So we're talking about the building, everything that's going on the inside, all of the work to the outside of it. It does also include certain soft costs such as architectural and engineering fees, construction period taxes and interest, and application fees. So there are some fees that are associated with review for our projects. Those can be included as eligible expenditures. What does not included are acquisition costs, expenditures attributable to enlargement or additions. So if you're building an addition, or if you're digging out a crawl space to create a basement, those are increasing the volume of the building, so it's not an eligible expenditure. Landscaping or site work, in most cases, in some very specific circumstances, if there is a historic something that is listed as a contributing resource within the nomination. So if it's a historic wall or pool sometimes, those can be eligible site work, but in large part site work is not eligible. Furnishings and other sorts of personal property, so like stoves, refrigerators, drapery, things like that are all considered personal property, so those are also not eligible. We still review all of that, but it's not kind of a part of what you would be getting back with your credits. When we did a revision of our program regulations in 2016, one of the new things is that a CPA, so a certified public accountant, must verify all expenses for all projects. So that's across the board. Any project that is seeking tax credits does need to invest in having a CPA do a cost certification. That is an eligible expense, so you'd be able to put that in and get credits back on that. So that's kind of one good thing. I mentioned about the substantial rehabilitation test and how, it does need to be kind of a bigger project. It can't just be kind of a very, very small little thing. For the federal program, the eligible expenditures must exceed the owner's adjusted basis or $5,000, whichever is greater. For the state program, we split it between non-owner occupied and owner occupied. So non-owner occupied, so that's rentals, Airbnbs, stores, things like that. The eligible expenditures must be at least 50% of the building's assessed value. So we're just looking at the building by itself, not the land. For owner occupied, the threshold is a bit lower. The eligible expenditures must be at least 25% of the building's assessed value. So that's kind of, recognizing that a lot of the smaller owner occupied projects are just smaller, so we make it a little bit more accessible. Again, we love our forms. Here you can see a state Part 2 form. And so on the left-hand side, we're looking at what is the architectural feature that we're talking about. So, roof, gutters and downspouts, front porch, windows. So on the left-hand side, you'll talk about what is the existing condition? What does it look like? What is its condition? Do you have photos that are showing it? Do you have drawings? You kind of note that there so that we can refer from this written narrative to the supplementary information and kind of see what you're talking about. On the right, you'll explain how will it be treated in the rehabilitation. Will it be repaired? Will it be replaced? Will it be left alone? You kind of want to talk about those things. So even if you have a roof that you're not planning on doing anything to, just include a note of that so that we're not thinking, did they forget about the roof? Is something happening? We just kind of want to go through every part of the house and kind of talk about what we're doing to it. That does not mean that you need to go room by room, although sometimes that does happen, but you can do things like flooring or walls and ceilings or, something like that and kind of go through those different sorts of broad areas. The Part 2, this is really the most important part of the application because this is what we rely on to review the work being done, provide guidance, and make sure that your finished project will meet the standards and that you're able to get your credits. So it's very important that time and attention is spent on this part of the Part 2 to really give us a good bit of information. And again, don't worry so much about knowing the proper technical terms, just be as descriptive as you can. Photo keys are very important when we're talking about the Part 2. I mentioned for the Part 1, you just need about 20 photos because we're just kind of trying to make sure that the overall building still retains its integrity. When we're looking at the Part 2, we really need the photographs to be kind of comprehensive and almost be so that we could walk through the house in our minds as we're looking at your written description of work. So in order to help facilitate that, do submit a plan of the existing building that is tied to the photograph. So you can see right here that little image with the number 5 with an arrow. You can imagine that as picture number 5 is that person was standing right there and the arrow is pointing in the direction that they were looking at. And that kind of helps us to orient ourselves. What sort of things do you want to photograph? All areas of the structure. I'm not saying that you need to have every corner of every, tiny bathroom and closet, but all areas need to be somewhat documented. Interior and exterior needs to be documented, and we do need detail and overall photos. However, don't just send detail photos. I have on occasion received applications where almost all of the photos are very, very close up of a corner or a bit of a window and no kind of overall context photos. And so we really need to see the whole spaces so that we can have that kind of good record of what was there at the beginning so that we can also review what's there at the end and make sure that everything kind of matches up. You don't have to send photos of every single little bit, but especially as the project progressive, it's always better to have something documented for your own peace of mind. Where it comes into a situation, a difficult situation is if something's not photographed, we see something potentially concerning later on in the project, and then we don't know kind of what happened and where that happened. So I always encourage people to take more photos than you think you're going to need. You don't need to print them all out, but they're at least there if you need them down the road to explain something or to show something. Photos should show the existing conditions even if the work has already started. Again, it's beneficial to have the application done in before work starts, but if work has already begun, just show us what's happening. Before rehab photos are essential. If, say, the project is mostly done and you don't have any before pictures, it is possible that that would prevent you from participating in the historic tax credit program, just because we do need to have that documentation of where things started, where things end, so that we are doing our due diligence in ensuring that the work was actually done and the credits are being appropriately awarded. So that's kind of something to be aware of. With the Part 2, you always need to provide floor plans showing the existing floor plans. So we want kind of what does the building look like now. The drawings do not have to be architect drawn or even drawn to scale. They really just need to be clear enough that we can tell, approximately where doors are, stairs, windows, things like that. But as you can see in this image, even just kind of a sketch with a ruler is perfectly fine. If changes to the plan are proposed, so if you're planning on making those changes, include an additional set of drawings showing that after proposal. Do not combine both before and after drawings into one kind of drawing, just because it gets confusing and it's hard for us to kind of tell what's happening. If there are changes to the exterior elevations, you do also need to submit before and after elevation drawings. Again, it doesn't have to be architect designed. You can have if you're not art inclined, you can have a friend do a sketch, but you kind of just need to show us the before and after and what's being done. Because the Part 2 is such a big part of this application, we kind of want to go over the essentials. So Part 2 essentials: the signed Part 2 application, the written narrative of the proposed work, photographs, plans and elevation drawings, again, if needed, specifications for replacements, say all of the windows are modern vinyl windows that are falling apart and you're replacing all of them. You'll want to send us kind of the specification sheet from the manufacturer of what you're proposing, just so we can see that. And then the Part 2 fee and billing statements. So those are kind of the parts that are in the Part 2 that are important. One of the big things is that we understand that changes happen, especially when you open up walls in old buildings. There's always something new to find and some sort of new surprise. So all changes to the project scope must be reviewed and approved. So as things are happening, as things are changing, always, always, always submit an amendment. There's a form for that, obviously. So you submit an amendment, description of what's changed, how things are changing, photographs and plans if needed, and then we can then review that and respond back. You don't have to submit an amendment individually. You can, say you have 5 different items that have changed over the past 2 weeks. You can group them all in a single amendment submission, so you're not kind of having to create multiple documents, and send that in, and we can respond to that. The last bit is if we send you, so how this process always works is that you send us what you want to do, and then we respond back in writing with conditions, requests for things or kind of ways to make it meet the standards. if our response letter asks a question or if it requests additional information, make sure you send that information as an amendment. There was a reason why we asked that question or requested that additional information, and if we never get that, it can often happen where at the end of the project that could then become an issue. So always, read those letters, make sure to respond to them if we are asking for questions or asking questions. I mentioned this substantial rehabilitation measuring period earlier. And so we were talking about that substantial rehabilitation. So that was the 100% of adjusted basis for federal program, the 50% for income producing in the state, the 25% for homeowner occupied for the state. Those requirements need to be met within a specific measuring period. And this is we're just going to touch on this because it's actually a very complex issue that kind of depends on the project. And we're always happy to talk to people about their particular project when looking at this. But in broad, kind of in general, the spending threshold needs to be met during either a 2 or a 5-year measuring period. The 2 is kind of standard, so that's 2 years for this substantial rehabilitation test to be met. The 5-year period is for phased projects, so that means the project is done in distinct phases. This 2 and 5-year measuring period does not mean that the project needs to be done in 2 or 5 years. I recently had a project that is about, at this point, almost 18 years old, and it's still fine just because the way that they've structured the program. Most projects do not have an issue with this substantial rehabilitation test, but we want to make sure that everybody's always thinking about this and just being aware that this is something that could happen or that you need to be aware of. For the federal program, the phasing plan needs to be in place prior to the start of construction. So a phasing plan is basically you saying, this work is going to be done during this period, between these 2 dates, and we're estimating it's going to be this amount of money. The second phase is going to be this work between these 2 dates with this amount of money. That needs to be in place for the federal program before work begins. The state, we're able to be a little bit more flexible, so sometimes we have projects that realize they are taking longer, and so they want to phase it kind of on midway. We allow that. With the federal program, the adjusted basis, so that's that minimum amount that you need to spend, is determined at the start of the measuring period. So we can talk, if that comes into play for you, we can definitely talk one-on-one individually about your specific project. For the state program, the assessed value is determined the year prior to the start of the project. So that's that amount, that 50 or 25% that you need to spend. It's dependent on the year before the work begins. So again, these are very complex details with these 2 programs, and we always just encourage people to talk to us individually if you have questions about these. The final step, again, love our forms, is the Part 3 application form. The Part 3 is the only time when you have to use the state form, even if you're doing the state and the federal program, just because our form has different tax information because you're not dealing with the IRS, you're dealing with the Virginia Department of Taxation. This form has the starting and completion dates, the eligible and ineligible expenditures, the assessed value of the building and the year prior to work beginning, and the use of the property. Make sure that the CPA report that you submit, so that Certified Public Accountant report on the expenses, make sure all of those dates and the expenditures match up with what you're putting in your Part 3 form, because they are supposed to match up. They should be identical. Credits are claimed in the year that the project is completed. So if your project is completed in 2021, that's the first year that your credits are being claimed. For the state credit, you must include a financial report created by a CPA. Under $500,000 total expenses, you can do an agreed upon procedures report, which is a little bit less robust than an audit, which is required for over $500,000 in total expenses. And again, this is total expenses, not just the eligible expenses. So your whole project, site work, addition, all of that kind of goes into whether or not you need an agreed upon procedures report or an audit. And again, the information in your Part 3 application form for the state and federal should match the audit or the agreed upon procedures report that is being provided by that CPA. The last part, the thing that we always love to see, are the Part 3 photos. As much as possible, try to match up the Part 3 photos with where you took the Part 2 photos. We understand that sometimes that's not possible, but it just kind of helps us as we're going through our photos, because we do look at the pre-rehab and post-rehab photos and kind of go through the building as if we're walking through the past and the present. Include a photo key as well. That especially helps if the photos aren't able to be exactly located in the same places, but that definitely helps us in our review. Take another water break. So here's the second part of the presentation, where we're actually going to talk about the Secretary of Interior's standards for rehabilitation and kind of how we use the standards to guide these tax credit projects. Within kind of preservation guidance, there are 4 treatment standards: preservation, rehabilitation, restoration, and reconstruction. Each one of those has its own little set of guidelines. For the tax credit program, what we are concerned with is the rehabilitation, and that is rehabilitation allows for changes in use and modifications to suit new uses. And so that's kind of where we look to for our guidance on what we're looking for a building participating in this program. To start, I wanted to kind of give 4 general tips, and if you forget everything else about the standards, as long as you remember these kind of 4 general tips, that'll kind of put you in a good position. So the first general tip is to retain and repair rather than replace. And so as much as possible, we are wanting to maintain the historic fabric that is existing and repair it rather than just say, let's throw it out and put something new in. So that's kind of one of the primary guiding principles as you might be thinking about a project. Identify the character-defining features early in the project planning. So is it the plan that is important? Is it some sort of detailing? Is it a distinctive material? You know, what kind of makes your building unique? Once you figure that out and once you kind of identify that, you can then kind of plan your project around trying to retain those features that make your building special and unique. Retain historic character even if the use of the building changes. As you can see in these images, this is a historic school that was then converted into residential spaces. And so in these school conversions, even though it's not a school anymore, the hallways are retained. Chalkboards and coat closets are reutilized within the new units. So even though the use has completely changed, we're still keeping those bits of historic character that kind of show us that it was a school in the new use. New additions are possible with this program. That's one of the things that makes rehabilitation a good way to look at these sorts of buildings, but the new construction does need to be compatible with the historic building. As you can see in this example, we've got a modern construction addition at the rear of the building. It's tucked away in back. It's using a similar brick color, but the design is differentiated from the historic building so that it kind of recedes from view and doesn't impact the overall character of that building or even its overall site. So again, it's possible to do additions with these projects, but they do need to be sensitive and compatible. And sometimes some buildings, it's very difficult to do additions with. That's one of the things that we are happy to help with, kind of in figuring out what's possible. So now we're going to go through the standards. The standards are 10 guidelines that are purposefully vague because they need to be applicable to everything from a small, farmstead cottage to a massive warehouse complex. So these standards are specifically vague, but kind of get to the essentials of what is required for historic preservation projects. So standard 1 is a property shall be used for its intended purpose or placed in a new use that requires minimal changes to the defining characteristics of the building and its site and environment. So in this example, we have a proposed inappropriate new use. on the upper picture, it's a former cold storage building, which has no windows because obviously if you want something to stay cold, you don't want sunlight coming in. The proposal for this building was to convert it to residential use, but in order to do that, people don't want to live in a windowless bunker. You would need to create windows and outside access and things like that. While some sort of new use for this cold storage building is likely possible, residential might not be the most appropriate new use because of kind of those other needs. And it's incompatible for the tax credit program because it requires kind of too many changes to make it work. On the flip side, we have this former brewery that was then created to office space. So you can see on the lower left-hand side, they created a glass atrium for kind of a new entry area, but mostly left the interior spaces open so that the overall character of this building could be retained. So even though it's no longer a brewery, it's now kind of standard office space, it still retains its character. Standard 2 is kind of the one that we use the most. It's basically the historic character of the property shall be retained and preserved. Shouldn't be removing historic materials or altering the features that characterize a property. In this example on the left, you can see vinyl siding and modern windows that really kind of has removed many of the historic features. On the right, you can see the original siding, so the thin wood siding, the cornice, the trim, and even the historic wood windows. You can really see that the historic character has been retained on that right side. Here's another example of kind of retention of historic character. When we're looking at character, we also are talking about the inside. So in this example, the before was kind of a raw industrial type space. The after image, you can't really tell where you are. And that's not to say that in doing a rehabilitation like this, you wouldn't be cleaning it up and making it look nice. But we want to still be able to understand the building that we're in and not kind of feel like we're transported into a office building that could be, from any point in the 90s. So that's kind of something to think about. Historic plans are essential to historic character. So in this example on the left, the historic plan is intact and legible. After the example on the right, the circulation paths, so the stairs have been moved, all of the interior partitions have been removed, and we kind of have no sense of the historic building remaining. It's important to remember that we are not expecting, say, in the left-hand side, that every single little wall is being retained. Definitely things like corridors, stairs, kind of those primary spaces are the most important. And then as you get into units for kind of bigger buildings, you have a little bit more flexibility. That's still not saying that you kind of have carte blanche to, demolish every single wall, but there's a lot more flexibility with that. But you kind of want to use the historic plan with your new plan. Another part about retention of historic spaces is anytime there's subdivision of a tall space proposed, we really need to be mindful of what's being impacted. So in this example, you can see at the top, the kind of 2-story tall windows, arched openings on that, that's kind of left open, and then after they put in a floor so that it's impacting not only the windows and the space from the inside, but you will very likely be able to see that from the outside as well. So then we're also impacting the outer view. So this would be a situation where the treatment is not compatible. Retention of historic spaces also has to do with corridors. So avoid lowering ceilings in primary spaces. So corridors or, the foyer or, main spaces. New mechanical systems need to be sensitively placed, and we're always happy to work with people on that. If you're putting new systems in, we always recommend submitting a reflected ceiling plan that kind of shows us where everything is going to be. You never want to intersect, cover, or otherwise obstruct windows. You can see in the bottom image right there, they made an effort to not impact the historic window. However, in creating kind of that soffit, it's kind of called more attention to this new feature. So we always want to be mindful of kind of where we're locating these systems and how we're installing them. And that's one of the things that we help with. And also avoid the destruction of historic materials. Use existing penetrations if at all possible. We understand that it's not always possible, but you want to, as much as possible, in any of the work that you're doing, try to use the old building and what it's giving you for your new use and kind of work around that as much as possible. These are just another two examples. In the upper example, the plan shape is kind of retained, but most of the walls have been removed, so this wouldn't be kind of retaining the historic plan. The bottom image, the historic corridor, is being left alone and just kind of repaired and retained. Standard 3 really talks about conjectural features and also creating a sense of false historicism. So in this example, you can see that the building on the left has modern kind of colonial revival shutters installed, the broken pediments, and the siding, and that's not in keeping with the building's original style, which you can see on the right with kind of those distinctive features. So in this situation, we would say that the building on the left, because it is using architectural modern features that are from different sorts of buildings, different sorts of eras, we would say that the building or the work on the left doesn't meet standard 3 because we're pretending this building is a different style than it actually is. Standard 4 talks about how properties change over time, and just because a building has changed doesn't necessarily mean that that change isn't important in it of itself. And the best way I've found to talk about this is when we're looking at kind of these streamlined storefronts that we all know from main streets all over America. This is not the original storefront of this early 1900s commercial storefront. However, this kind of streamlined, modern storefront is by itself significant. So if the proposal came in to remove this, let's say, 1950s storefront and revert it back to what it looked like in the 1900s, we would say that that work is not in compliance with standard 4 because the existing storefront, this distinctive, funky sign of its time, is important by itself. Standard 5 talks about distinctive features, finishes, and construction techniques and how we need to retain and repair those as much as possible. So again, this is getting back to that, identifying what's important about your building. Is it distinctive detailings? Is it a construction technique? Is it a, specific material that was used? When you have those situations, that's kind of what is influencing what you need to prioritize and protect. Standard 6 deals with deterioration, and as much as possible, deteriorated features need to be repaired. If they need to be replaced, they need to be replaced in kind, and replacement of missing features needs to be, so say something is just completely gone, you need to have documentary, physical, or pictorial evidence to replace it. So here, this image is just showing selective replacement of wood siding on an old building. This example is kind of showing damaged historic features that are selectively repaired. So you can see the medallion on the left has epoxy repairs being done. The column capital on the right is just having selective kind of epoxy done. So they're not removing the whole historic feature, they're just kind of replacing what is only absolutely necessary. This example is showing kind of why historic documentation is important. The image in the upper left is the before. You can see that there's no porch. You can maybe see that there might have been a porch, maybe there's some ghosting or some other physical features that are showing that something used to be there. Luckily, in this project, they were able to find a historic photo that actually showed what was there. So they were able to put back on the appropriately historic matching porch on this building. Windows are something that we talk about a lot. Windows are definitely important to retain. If you have your historic windows, it is important to maintain and repair them. Storm windows are eligible costs, and typically installing a well-fitting storm will give you energy efficiency that you might be looking for that a single glaze won't be giving. So that's something, if you have historic windows, definitely assume that you'll be keeping them and repairing them. Here's just some funny images of why windows are so important. So you can see the left-hand image where it's kind of been replaced by plexiglass, and then the image on the right where we have modern windows in very old openings. Standard 7 talks about chemical or physical treatments and just kind of using the most gentlest treatment possible. So you can see on the left-hand side, this is an example of sandblasted brick. Sandblasting is never an option. On the right-hand side, you can see incorrect rebuild and repointing. These are, masonry is one of the biggest issues that we have when kind of at the part 3 is inappropriate repointing or just kind of not well done repointing. So it's very important if masonry work is being done as a part of your overall project, definitely talk to us. We have a lot of good guidance, and we can kind of let you know what you need to be paying attention to. It is very important, especially with masonry, that you are monitoring the work that's being done, just to make sure that the masonry repair that's being done is appropriate and it's not going to kind of cause you issues down the road. Standard 8, we barely ever have to deal with. It deals with archaeological resources. I can only recall 3 times that I've had to have one of our staff archaeologists talk to them about one of our projects. It's not out of the realm of possibility. We do have archaeologists at the state that are happy to do kind of initial kind of looking at plans. Sometimes with geothermal we need to do that, or if there's a septic field being dug. Occasionally there might be a requirement to have kind of a more in-depth investigation done, but again, that's very, very, very rare. But we'll definitely let you know if anything like that is needed. Standard 9 has to do with new additions and how they should not destroy historic materials. The new work needs to be differentiated from the old, but still needs to be compatible with the massing, size, scale, and architectural features to protect the historic integrity of the property and its site and environments. So in this example, the additions need to be compatible in height. So you can see the original building is a single grand structure. There was a proposed hotel tower that was highly visible. You can see that in the bottom right-hand image. It's highly visible, and so it does not meet the standards. It dwarfs the historic building. The new proposal was for office use with a revised addition. So now this new addition is lower in scale. It's separated from the historic building by this hyphen. So the new proposal could not be easily seen, and so it now does meet the standards. This is just kind of a silly example of a historic, building on the left and then a modern construction on the right that is not compatible in size. Alterations are possible with this program. Again, rehabilitation allows flexibilities. One of the things that we typically see are historic porches being enclosed. Those can be done in a number of different ways, but if there's a way to make it kind of look like a historic porch, that's just kind of meets all needs. We're retaining the character, but also giving additional living space. Rooftop additions are something that we deal with a lot, and many projects can have rooftop additions, but they can't be highly visible. In this example, you see this kind of access white unit that was built on top of the historic penthouse, and because of this building's narrowness, this addition was highly visible, and it actually needed to be removed because this work was done prior to any sort of review and approval. So, whenever we're looking at any rooftop additions, we know that everybody loves amenity space, but it really needs to be done in such a way that we're not impacting the character of the building. Standard 10, the last standard, new additions and adjacent new construction need to be done in such a way that they can be removed in the future. So in this example, you can see this historic building has basically been chopped and subsumed by the new construction. This would likely not be very easily reversible, and so we would say that it was in conflict with standard number 10. This is an example where the historic building had a vacant lot next to it, and so the new construction, which is that lighter colored building on the right, is connected to the old building by this kind of glass hyphen. And they used existing, penetrations to provide access from the old building to the new building. but the new building could be removed at a future date and not impact the historic building. So we would say that this meets standard 10. This is kind of the end of my presentation. These are the two kind of websites for the federal program, the state program. You can find a lot of good information on the Park Services program. They have things called preservation briefs and technical notes that kind of get into the nitty-gritty bits of different sorts of subjects. And the state program, we have all of our guidance documents. We also have a zip file that we can email you if you just email us, which brings us to program contacts. So again, I am the program supervisor. There's my email and my phone number. If you have questions about the part 1 or kind of the application process, Chris Novelli is our tax credit specialist, and he is a whiz with helping especially first-time applicants kind of figure out the paperwork process and what's needed. So I would definitely suggest calling or emailing him. The other two reviewers at our office are Carolyn Zamanian and Summer Louthan. There are their emails right there. And we're always happy to provide technical assistance, even if you're not looking, maybe you're not doing a tax credit project. This is kind of what we do, is help people with their rehabilitations. And so, we always encourage people to reach out to us. But yep, that is my presentation, and I look forward to questions.
Okay, this is Julie Chop again. We can start with the questions that were asked in the chat box. So the first one is from Carolyn Barnes. She's interested in the income limits, if that is only earned income, or if fully retired doesn't include Social Security and any retirement income.
So we don't have any income limits. It's really about the tax liability. And so there just has to be a tax liability, but there's no income limits on how much or little you make. It just really has to do with, do you have a tax liability to offset against the credits? Did that answer the question, hopefully?
Oh, okay. She said thank you in the chat.
Great.
Okay, great. And the second question from David Smith, can you make your PowerPoint available to download? Yes, I can. With your permission, I can post the PowerPoint that you provided. We'll post that along with the recording of this session. Okay, so number 3 is from the Craddock Civic League. Are publicly owned structures, for example, historic libraries, fire stations, eligible for other types of credits if the public entity was to renovate them, since public entities don't pay income taxes?
Yes, so that is where it gets tricky, and it's outside of my wheelhouse. So nonprofits or state entities would need to develop a alternate kind of LLC. And again, I am not a lawyer or a tax accountant, but there does need to be some sort of structure put in place whereby there is a taxed entity that can then gain the credits. So I know if you look at the city of Danville, they've actually done quite a bit with tax credits. They have kind of a development authority that works in conjunction with the city. And so that's kind of how they've worked it out. And then they work with developers. So it's a complex situation. And it really depends on the unique specifics. But it's not out of the realm of possibility. It just requires some careful attention, careful structuring of the entity. But yeah.
Thank you very much. Okay, the last question in the chat box was from Howie. Does the 25% assessed value, is it just for the building or for both the building and the land?
So for the state, so we're specifically talking about the state program right now. It's just the building, and it's the building in the year prior to work beginning. So, so whatever that building value is, the year prior to when your project starts. And that's both for, so the 25% is for a homeowner occupied structure, and then it's 50% of that building value for an income producing property. The federal program is a different kettle of fish. So Howie, speak up if you want me to talk about that as well. But if we're talking about a homeowner property, you're just going to be dealing with the state.
Yeah, it was just the for the homeowner's property. I really appreciate it. Thank you.
So now if anybody on the line would like to ask a question, feel free to unmute yourself and ask away.
Hey, Julie, this is Robin. I'm just going to tack on to the last question that Howie asked. So just to clarify, so if your value, just for easy math for our heads, is 400,000, then your project has to be 100,000 or more?
Yes.
Your total project? Okay. Yep. Thank you.
Well, yeah. Math. Well, hopefully, you know, if there aren't, you know, we can hang out for a little bit, but, you know, we try to make our presentations be broad enough that we try to answer all of our standard questions that we get.
I got another one if no one's going to jump in. I'm hogging Jessica's time. You talked about windows. I know those are a touchy subject. If our historical preservation board has a window that they approve, that's if our current historic window is not repairable, is that acceptable, or does it have to be the original window?
So there's differences. One thing to really remember, we are an independent entity, and so whatever individual design guidelines, they don't always necessarily meet the standards in the way that the state interprets the standards. So let's say we have historic windows that are just completely dry rotted out, and they are completely not salvageable, and you demonstrate that with photographs and you kind of make the case that you can't fix the windows. The replacement if we're talking about a small scale building, the replacement really does need to match the historic examples, especially if we're removing historic features. We've got a little bit more flexibility. Say there's modern vinyl windows in the building and, you know, we're kind of going back with something more historically appropriate. There's a little bit more flexibility just because we recognize we don't have historic features. But I would definitely say we would need to see what's being proposed, and then we review that kind of within the scope of the whole state. You know, we make our requirements kind of consistent across the whole state, which is why it gets kind of difficult when we're dealing with individual design review guidelines. So hopefully that helps to explain.
Yes, very well. Thank you.
Okay, it looks like we don't have any more questions. Are there any last minute questions that anybody has? Okay, if not, thank you everybody for joining us tonight. Thank you, Jessica, for your very informative presentation. And we will be posting the presentation on the city's website, as well as the PowerPoint that was presented, and the recording will also be on the city's YouTube channel. And then if with your permission, we can also include your contact information for those who want to ask further questions.
Certainly, yep, and we're always happy to do that. We are all mostly working remote these days. So just as an FYI, email is usually the easiest way to get in contact with any of us. You can call. It'll just usually take us a little bit to get back to you. But just wanted to let everybody know that.
All right. Thank you, everybody.
Excellent. Thank you.
Have a great night.
Since the last one.
Thank you. Thank you very, very much.